She was 62 years old, homeless, and she just bought a crumbling Stagecoach in for $10. Evelyn Carter sat in the driver's seat of her 2003 Honda Civic, staring at the piece of paper in her hands. The county auction receipt was barely legible, printed on cheap office paper that curled at the edges. But the words were clear enough: property acquired. Payment received. $10. $10. That's what it cost to own a piece of history. Or a death trap. She wasn't sure which yet. The car smelled like stale fast food, and the lavender air freshener sheet hung from the rearview mirror 3 months ago, back when she still thought things might turn around. Back when sleeping in a car felt temporary. Now the back seat was her bedroom, the trunk her closet, and the front passenger seat her kitchen, a collection of gas station snacks and bottled water that never seemed to last as long as she needed. She'd found the listing 2 weeks earlier on a library computer in a town whose name she'd already forgotten. Condemned property. Back taxes owed. Minimum bid, $10. At first, she thought it was a scam. No one sells real estate for the price of a lunch combo. But the county clerk's office confirmed it over the phone. An 1880s Stagecoach Inn, over 100 miles outside Billings, Montana. Structural damage. No utilities. Being sold as is for recovery of tax debt. "Ma'am, I gotta be honest," the clerk had said. "It's not livable. You'd be buying a pile of wood and some land nobody wants." But Evelyn had $47 in her checking account, a car that burned oil, and nowhere to go. A pile of wood was more than she had. The drive took 6 hours through vast stretches of Montana wilderness, where the highway cut through grasslands so wide they seemed to swallow the sky. She passed abandoned barns, rusted farm equipment, and towns that looked like they'd given up decades ago. The GPS lost signal twice. She almost turned back 3 times. When she finally pulled off onto a gravel road marked by a weathered wooden post, her hands were shaking. The road narrowed, hemmed in by overgrown brush and trees that hadn't been trimmed in years. Branches scraped against the car's roof. The suspension groaned over potholes deep enough to swallow a tire. And then she saw it. The Holloway Station Inn rose from the landscape like a ghost refusing to leave. 3 stories of weathered gray wood, sagging under the weight of time and neglect. The roof had collapsed in places, exposing skeletal rafters to the open sky. Windows gaped like hollow eyes, most of the glass long gone. The front porch tilted at a dangerous angle, held up by posts that looked ready to give out at any moment. It was worse than she'd imagined. It was hers. Evelyn killed the engine and stepped out. The silence hit her first, absolute and total, broken only by the wind moving through tall grass and the distant call of a bird she couldn't identify. The air smelled like earth and sage and something older, something that had been sitting undisturbed for a very long time. She walked toward the building, each step crunching on gravel mixed with broken glass. Up close, the decay was even more apparent. Paint peeled in long strips. The wood underneath was bleached and cracked. A metal sign hung by a single chain above the porch, swaying slightly: Holloway Station Inn, EST 1881. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the keys the county clerk had mailed her. 2 tarnished brass keys on a ring, heavy and cold in her palm. "You the one who bought this place?" Evelyn spun around. An old man stood at the edge of the clearing, leaning on a walking stick. He wore faded overalls and a flannel shirt, his face deeply lined and weathered. She hadn't heard him approach. "I am," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The man shook his head slowly, looking past her at the inn. "Thought the county would just tear it down. Been empty since I was a boy. I'm going to fix it up." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he glanced at the inn again, something dark passing across his face. "People say that place has secrets buried deeper than its foundation." A chill ran down Evelyn's spine that had nothing to do with the wind. The old man turned and started walking back the way he came, disappearing into the tree line without another word. Evelyn stood alone in the clearing, keys trembling in her hand, staring at the building that now belonged to her. The windows seemed to watch her. The wind pushed through the broken walls, creating sounds that almost resembled whispers. Before you go, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a like if you're enjoying this story. And comment below and let me know what country you're watching from. I love hearing from you all. She took a breath and stepped onto the porch. The boards groaned under her weight but held. She had no idea how right he was. Evelyn hadn't always been invisible. There was a time when people knew her name. When she walked into the Seattle Public Library's Capitol Hill branch every morning and the regulars would smile, wave, ask about her weekend. When she wore cardigans that matched her skirts and kept her graying hair in a neat bun. When she had a desk with her nameplate on it, a coffee mug that said, "World's Best Librarian," and a small photo of her and Daniel on their 20th anniversary. That version of Evelyn felt like someone else's life now. Daniel had been a high school history teacher. Quiet, thoughtful, the kind of man who remembered birthdays and left notes in her lunch bag. They'd never had much money, but they had enough. A small house in a decent neighborhood. A garden where Daniel grew tomatoes every summer. Plans to travel when they retired, nothing extravagant, just the national parks, maybe the Oregon coast. Then one Tuesday morning, Daniel collapsed in his classroom while teaching about the Civil War. Massive heart attack. He was dead before the ambulance arrived. He was 59 years old. The funeral costs came first. Then the hospital bills, even the deceased left debts behind. Their insurance covered some of it, but not enough. Never enough. Evelyn depleted their savings account, then their emergency fund. She took out a loan against the house. That's when the calls started. Debt consolidation companies. Financial advisors who promised to help. A man named Richard with a smooth voice who said he could restructure everything, make it manageable. She just needed to sign a few papers. Trust him. Let him handle it. She'd been drowning in grief, barely functional, and she'd signed. 6 months later, she realized Richard had been a scam. The restructured payments were predatory loans with interest rates that compounded faster than she could pay. The companies he'd funneled her money to didn't exist. By the time she understood what had happened, her savings were gone. The house was in foreclosure. Her credit was destroyed. She tried to fight it. Hired a lawyer she couldn't afford who told her she had a case, then disappeared after the retainer cleared. She filed disputes with credit agencies that went nowhere. She reached out to her sister in Portland, who said she'd help but never called back. Her nephew sent a text, "Sorry Aunt Ev, we're stretched pretty thin right now." The foreclosure notice came on a Wednesday. She had 30 days. She packed what fit in her car, a sleeping bag, a duffel of clothes, a box of books she couldn't bear to leave behind, and the photo of her and Daniel. Everything else went to an estate sale that barely covered the cost of the ads. On her last day in the house, she sat on the floor of the empty living room and cried until her throat hurt. Then she locked the door, left the keys on the kitchen counter, and drove away. At 62 years old, Evelyn became homeless. The first week was the hardest. She didn't know the rules yet, where you could park overnight without being hassled, which gas stations had the cleanest bathrooms, how to stretch $5 across 3 days. She tried shelters, but they were full or had age restrictions or felt more dangerous than sleeping in the car. She found work where she could. Cleaning rooms at a truck stop motel outside Spokane. Stocking shelves at a 24-hour grocery store. The jobs never lasted long. Managers didn't like hiring older women with no fixed address. Customers looked through her like she wasn't there. That was the worst part. Not the hunger or the cold or the ache in her back from sleeping in a seat that didn't recline properly. It was the invisibility. How people's eyes would slide past her, as if she'd already stopped existing. As if turning 60 as a woman without money meant you'd crossed some invisible threshold into irrelevance. She'd been scrolling through county auction sites at the library one afternoon, a library in a town whose name didn't matter, when she found the listing for the inn. $10. Condemned. Montana. It was insane. She knew that. A crumbling building in the middle of nowhere wasn't a solution. It was probably a faster way to die than living in her car. But as she stared at the grainy photo of the Holloway Station Inn on that library computer screen, something shifted in her chest. It wasn't hope exactly. It was something smaller and more desperate. A chance. The inn wasn't just a gamble. It was her last chance to exist again. The first thing Evelyn learned about the Holloway Station Inn was that it was colder inside than out. She pushed through the front door, it scraped against warped floorboards, the hinges screaming, and was hit by a wave of stale air that tasted like dust and decay. Sunlight filtered through the broken windows in thin, angled beams, illuminating particles that floated like snow in the stillness. The front room had probably been a lobby once. Now it was a graveyard of forgotten things, a collapsed reception desk, chairs with missing legs, wallpaper peeling in long strips to reveal bare wood underneath. The floor groaned under her weight. She tested each step carefully, certain that at any moment the boards would give way and swallow her whole. No electricity. No water. No heat. The county clerk hadn't lied about any of it. She spent the first hour just walking through the building, taking inventory of the damage. The second floor was worse than the first, 2 rooms had caved in completely, open to the sky. Rain and snow had gotten in for years, rotting everything they touched. The third floor was inaccessible, the staircase collapsed halfway up. By the time she found a room that seemed structurally sound, a corner space on the first floor with most of its walls intact and only one broken window, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon. She carried in her belongings from the car. A sleeping bag. A battery-powered lantern. A camping stove she'd bought at a clearance sale 2 months ago. A gallon jug of water. A box of granola bars. It all fit in the corner of the room, looking even more pathetic spread out than it had crammed in her trunk. This was home now. Evelyn set up the sleeping bag on the least rotted section of floor, then lit 3 candles and placed them on an overturned crate she'd found in the hallway. The small flames did almost nothing against the encroaching darkness, but they made the space feel less hostile. Almost livable. She heated a can of soup on the camping stove and ate it straight from the pot, sitting cross-legged on her sleeping bag. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling through the gaps in the walls. The nearest town, if you could call it that, was 18 miles away. A gas station, a post office, and a hardware store that doubled as a grocery. She'd seen maybe 6 people total when she stopped for supplies. Out here, she was completely alone. As night settled in, the inn began to change. The silence she'd noticed earlier gave way to sound. The building creaked and groaned like something breathing. Beams shifted overhead with sounds like footsteps. The wind pushed through broken windows and open doorways, creating low, mournful howls that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And beneath it all, something else. A rhythmic tapping. Faint. Irregular. Coming from somewhere deeper in the building. Evelyn tried to ignore it. Told herself it was just the house settling, just old wood and nails shifting in the cold. But the sound persisted, needling at the edges of her awareness until she couldn't sit still anymore. She grabbed her flashlight and stood. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust and shadow. She moved into the hallway, floorboards protesting with each step. The tapping seemed to come from the back of the building, toward what had probably been the kitchen. She found it past a narrow corridor lined with doors that hung crooked on broken hinges. The kitchen was a disaster, cabinets torn off the walls, a cast iron stove rusted beyond recognition, counters collapsed into piles of rotted wood. But in the far corner, beneath layers of grime and debris, she could make out the outline of a doorway. She approached carefully, sweeping the flashlight beam across the space. As she moved closer, she noticed something else: artifacts. Small pieces of the past that had survived the decay. A stack of ledgers on a shelf, their leather covers cracked and faded. She opened one carefully. Guest registry. Names written in elegant script, dates from the 1890s. John Miller, Boston. Margaret Ashford, San Francisco. Thomas Whitmore, Portland. A collection of keys hung on hooks near the doorway, dozens of them, each labeled with a room number in faded ink. A metal sign propped against the wall, its paint barely legible: Holloway Station Inn. Fine lodging. Established 1881. This place had been alive once. Full of travelers and conversation and the smell of cooking and the warmth of fires in winter. Now it was a tomb. The tapping sound came again, louder this time. Closer. Evelyn swept the flashlight across the kitchen floor and froze. Near the back wall, partially hidden by a collapsed section of counter, she saw it. A section of floorboards that didn't match the rest. Darker. Newer. And in the center, barely visible beneath decades of accumulated dirt, a rusted metal handle. A trapdoor. She knelt beside it, brushing away debris with her hand. The handle was attached to a heavy padlock, its body corroded but still intact. The wood around it was scratched, deep gouges that looked deliberate, as if someone had tried to pry it open and failed. The tapping sound came once more, and this time she realized where it was coming from. Below. But it was the locked door beneath the kitchen floorboards that made her pause. Evelyn spent the entire next morning trying to open the trapdoor. She started with her hands, pulling at the handle until her palms burned and her shoulders ached. The padlock didn't budge. The chain holding it was thick, industrial, the kind meant to keep something sealed permanently. She found a crowbar in her car's emergency kit and wedged it under the door's edge, throwing all her weight against it. The wood groaned but held. The lock remained intact. Whoever sealed this door hadn't wanted it opened. That fact alone made her more determined to see what was underneath. By noon, she admitted defeat. She needed tools. Real ones. Which meant a trip back to town. The drive took 40 minutes on the winding gravel road, her car kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the still air. The town, if it could even be called that, consisted of a single intersection with a blinking yellow light. The hardware store sat on the corner, a faded green building with a hand-painted sign, Mercer's Hardware and Feed. A bell chimed as she pushed through the door. The interior smelled like motor oil and sawdust. Shelves packed with tools, rope, paint cans, and farming equipment stretched toward the back. An older man stood behind the counter, reading a newspaper. He looked up as she entered, his expression neutral but assessing. "Help you find something?" he asked. "I need bolt cutters," Evelyn said. "Heavy-duty ones." He folded the newspaper slowly, studying her. "Bolt cutters. That's specific. What for?" "Old padlock I need to remove. Could just call a locksmith." "I'm 40 miles from the nearest locksmith," she said. "And I don't have that kind of money." The man grunted and moved toward a shelf, pulling down a pair of red-handled cutters. He set them on the counter. "These'll run you $48. Evelyn hesitated. That was most of what she had left. But she nodded and reached for her wallet. "You new around here?" the man asked as he rang up the purchase. "Just moved in. Bought the old Holloway place." His hand froze on the register keys. He looked at her like she'd just told him she'd bought a coffin. "The inn?" "That's the one." The man's jaw tightened. He finished the transaction in silence, bagging the bolt cutters with more force than necessary. When he handed her the bag, his expression had gone cold. "You want some advice?" he said quietly. "Sure. Leave that place alone. Sell it, burn it, walk away. But don't go digging. Evelyn felt a chill run through her. Digging into what? The man shook his head. Some places should stay forgotten. What happened there? He turned away, picking up his newspaper again. That'll be all, ma'am. Have a good day. Sir, I just want to know. I said that'll be all. The dismissal was absolute. Evelyn stood there for a moment, frustration and curiosity warring inside her. Then she grabbed the bag and left, the bell chiming behind her like a warning. The drive back felt longer. The man's words circled in her mind. Leave that place alone. Don't go digging. Some places should stay forgotten. What had happened at the Holloway Station Inn? By the time she pulled up to the building, the sun was already descending, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. She grabbed the bolt cutters and headed straight for the kitchen, her flashlight beam cutting through the gathering darkness. The trapdoor waited right where she'd left it, the padlock gleaming dully in the light. Evelyn positioned the cutters around the lock's shackle and squeezed. Her arms trembled with the effort. The metal resisted, then gave with a sharp crack that echoed through the empty building. The chain fell away, clattering against the floorboards. She stared at the handle for a long moment, her heart pounding. This was it. Last chance to walk away. To leave whatever was down there buried. Instead, she grabbed the handle and pulled. The door lifted with a groan of ancient hinges, revealing a rectangular opening in the floor. Stone steps descended into complete darkness, disappearing after just 4 or 5 stairs. Cold air rushed up from below, carrying with it a smell that made her stomach tighten, damp earth, thick mildew, and beneath it all, something faintly metallic. Old. Wrong. The tapping sound came again, louder now, echoing up from the depths. Evelyn's hands shook as she aimed her flashlight into the opening. The beam penetrated only a few feet before the darkness swallowed it whole. Before you continue, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like if you're hooked on this story. And drop a comment below telling me what country you're watching from. I love seeing where you all are tuning in. She took a breath, steadied herself, and placed one foot on the first stone step. It was solid. Cold. She took another step. Then another. She took her flashlight and descended into the root cellar, unaware she was walking into a 140-year-old secret. The cellar was impossibly large. Evelyn reached the bottom of the stone steps and swept her flashlight across the space, her breath catching. The room stretched out in front of her, far wider and deeper than the inn's foundation should have allowed. Stone walls rose on all sides, their surfaces slick with moisture and age. The ceiling was low, supported by thick wooden beams that looked original to the 1880s. The floor was packed dirt, uneven and soft in places. Wooden shelves lined the walls, sagging under the weight of time and abandonment. Shattered mason jars littered the surfaces, their contents long since rotted away. Burlap sacks had split open, spilling what might have once been potatoes or grain but was now just dark, decomposed matter. Rusted tools hung from nails, a pickaxe, a shovel, things that belonged in a root cellar but somehow felt menacing in the darkness. The air was thick and difficult to breathe, heavy with dampness and the smell of earth that hadn't seen sunlight in over a century. Evelyn moved deeper into the space, her footsteps muffled by the dirt floor. The flashlight beam danced across the walls, catching details that made her skin prickle. Water stains. Dark patches that could have been mold or something worse. And then, at the far end of the cellar, something that stopped her cold. The back wall was different. While the rest of the cellar was built from rough-cut stone, dark with age and moisture, this section was constructed from lighter-colored rock. Newer. The mortar between the stones was cleaner, less degraded. Someone had built this wall long after the original cellar was dug. Someone had sealed off part of the room. Evelyn approached slowly, her heart hammering. As she got closer, the flashlight revealed something that made her stomach drop. Scratches. Deep gouges carved into the stone, clustered around the edges of the wall. They weren't random, they were deliberate, frantic. As if someone had clawed at the stone with their bare hands, trying to break through. Trying to get out. Or trying to get in. She ran her fingers over the marks, feeling the rough texture. Some of the scratches went deep enough to leave grooves she could fit her fingernail into. The image that formed in her mind, someone down here in the darkness, scraping at stone until their fingers bled, made her shudder. What had happened in this place? She stepped back, sweeping the light along the base of the wall. That's when she noticed it, a small gap in the stonework, a crevice where two stones didn't quite meet. Something metallic glinted inside. Evelyn knelt and reached in, her fingers brushing against something cold and rectangular. She pulled it out carefully. A tin box, about the size of a hardcover book. The metal was rusted and dented, but intact. She pried at the lid with her fingernails until it popped open with a brittle crack. Inside were papers. The first thing she pulled out was a stack of newspaper clippings, yellowed and fragile, the edges crumbling at her touch. She held them up to the flashlight, squinting at the faded text. The Billings Gazette. March 1883. The headline made her blood run cold, 2 travelers missing along Stagecoach route, foul play suspected. She read through the article, her hands trembling. A wealthy couple from San Francisco, traveling east to visit family. Last seen at a stagecoach in outside Billings. Never arrived at their destination. Search parties found nothing. The innkeeper, a man named Silas Holloway, claimed they'd left in good health. There were more clippings. Same story, different angles. One mentioned that locals suspected robbery. Another noted that the couple had been carrying a substantial amount of money. None of the articles offered resolution. The couple had simply vanished. Evelyn set the clippings aside and reached into the box again. Her fingers closed around something small and cold. A locket. Tarnished silver, the chain broken. She opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph, or what remained of one. The image was faded, but she could still make out a woman's face. Young, maybe 30. Dark hair pulled back. Serious expression. Written on the back in tiny script, Margaret, 1882. Margaret. One of the missing travelers. The final item in the box was a letter, folded into a small square. The paper was so brittle it nearly fell apart in her hands. She unfolded it with agonizing slowness, holding it close to the light. The handwriting was shaky, panicked. Some words were smeared, as if the writer's hands had been wet, or bloody. If you're reading this, you found what they tried to hide. Evelyn's pulse roared in her ears. She read on, the words swimming in the dim light. I cannot live with what I've done. The guilt consumes me. I sealed them behind the wall, thinking I could forget. But I hear them. Every night. Scratching. They won't let me sleep. They won't let me forget. May God forgive me, for I cannot forgive myself. No signature. No date. Just those terrible words. Evelyn's hands shook so badly the flashlight beam jerked wildly across the walls. She looked at the newer section of stone, at the desperate scratches, and understanding crashed over her like ice water. They were buried here. The missing couple. Margaret and her husband. They weren't missing. They were here. Behind that wall. Hidden by Silas Holloway. Sealed away like a secret too terrible to speak aloud. And then she heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from behind the wall. Evelyn didn't sleep that night. She sat in her sleeping bag, the tin box and its contents spread out in front of her by candlelight. The letter. The clippings. The locket with Margaret's face staring up at her from another century. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those scratches on the wall. Heard that tapping sound echoing up from the darkness. By dawn, she'd made her decision. She was going to break through that wall. The hardware store opened at 8. Evelyn was there at 7:55, parked outside, waiting. The same man from before unlocked the door, his expression souring the moment he recognized her. "Sledgehammer," she said before he could speak. "And a heavy crowbar. The biggest you have." He didn't move. "What are you doing out there?" "What I have to." "Lady, I told you." "I know what you told me," Evelyn interrupted, her voice harder than she intended. "Now are you going to sell me the tools or not?" He stared at her for a long moment, then disappeared into the back. He returned with a 12-pound sledgehammer and a 4-foot crowbar. Set them on the counter without a word. Rang up the sale. Evelyn paid with the last of her cash, leaving her with $8 to her name. As she turned to leave, the man spoke quietly. "Whatever you find down there, it won't bring anyone peace. Some things are better left buried." She looked back at him. "Not this. Not anymore." Before returning to the inn, she made one more stop. The town's library was a single room attached to the post office, 3 computers, 6 shelves of books, and a librarian who looked surprised to have a visitor. Evelyn asked about local history. The woman directed her to a filing cabinet in the corner marked Historical Records. It took her an hour to find what she was looking for. The Holloway Station Inn. Built in 1881 by Silas Holloway, a businessman from back east. Operated as a stagecoach stop for 3 years. Then, in March of 1884, the building burned. Mysterious fire. Started in the middle of the night. By the time neighbors arrived, it was already gutted. Silas Holloway vanished the same night. Never seen again. Some locals thought he died in the fire. Others whispered darker theories, that he'd set it himself to cover something up. That he'd stolen gold from travelers. That bodies were buried on the property but never found. The inn was rebuilt by Holloway's brother in 1885, but it never thrived. It changed hands a dozen times over the next century, each owner staying only a few years before abandoning it. Eventually, the county seized it for unpaid taxes. Evelyn printed the articles and drove back, her mind racing. The sun was high when she descended into the cellar, sledgehammer in one hand, flashlight in the other. She stood before the false wall, studying it in the harsh beam of light. The scratches seemed deeper now, more desperate. "I'm sorry this happened to you," she whispered to whoever might be listening. "But I'm going to make it right." She raised the sledgehammer and swung. The impact reverberated through the cellar like a gunshot. Chips of stone and mortar exploded from the wall. She swung again. And again. Each strike sent shockwaves up her arms, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The mortar was old, weakened by time and moisture. After a dozen strikes, the first stone came loose, tumbling to the dirt floor with a heavy thud. Then another. And another. Hours passed. Her shoulders screamed. Sweat soaked through her shirt despite the cold. But the wall was giving way. She switched to the crowbar, wedging it into the gaps and prying stones free. The opening grew, 1 foot wide, then 2, then 3. Dust filled the air, making her cough and choke. And then the wall gave way completely. A section of stones collapsed inward with a deafening crash, revealing a hollow space beyond. Evelyn stumbled back, coughing, waving away the dust cloud. When it settled, she aimed her flashlight into the opening. A hidden chamber. Maybe 6 feet by 8 feet. Stone walls on all sides. And on the floor, partially covered by rubble. 2 skeletons. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. They lay side by side, curled slightly, as if they'd been trying to protect each other. The bones were yellowed with age, but intact. And they were still wearing clothes, rotted fabric that had once been fine, expensive. A woman's dress. A man's suit. Margaret and Thomas Ashford. The Missing Travelers from 1883. Evelyn's eyes burned. She'd known, intellectually, what she would find. But seeing it, the physical proof of such a terrible act, made it real in a way that hollowed her out. These people had been murdered. Sealed in this tomb while still alive or freshly dead. Left to rot in darkness while the man who killed them went on with his life. Until guilt drove him to vanish. She stepped carefully through the opening, mindful not to disturb the remains. The flashlight beam swept across the small space, catching details. A wedding ring still on one skeletal hand. The remnants of a pocket watch. And beside the bodies, partially hidden by fallen stones, a leather satchel. Evelyn knelt beside it, her hands shaking. The leather was rotted, falling apart at her touch, but the contents inside had been protected. She pulled it free from the debris and carefully opened it. Inside were bundles of papers. Letters, dozens of them, tied with string. And beneath those, something else. A single sheet of paper, folded once. She unfolded it slowly. The writing was frantic, barely legible. And in places, the ink had a rusty brown color that made her stomach turn. Blood. The confession was written in blood. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were bundles of letters, and a confession written in blood. Evelyn carried the satchel upstairs, unable to remain in that tomb any longer. She sat by candlelight in her makeshift room, the confession spread before her, and began to read. My name is Silas Holloway, and I am a murderer. The words were jagged, written by a hand that shook with either fear or illness. Some sentences trailed off. Others were scratched out and rewritten. But the story was clear. January 1883. A blizzard trapped two travelers at the inn, Thomas and Margaret Ashford, traveling from San Francisco. Wealthy. Educated. Kind people, Silas wrote. They paid in gold coins. He'd seen the money. More than he'd make in 5 years. And he'd made a choice that would haunt him until his death. He'd poisoned their evening meal. Watched them grow weak, confused. Then he'd carried their bodies to the cellar while they were still breathing, sealed them behind a wall he'd built himself. Took their gold. Burned their belongings. I thought I could live with it, he wrote. I was wrong. The guilt consumed him. He heard them at night, scratching, crying out. Whether real or imagined, it drove him mad. He tried to turn himself in, walked to the sheriff's office twice, but couldn't force the words out. The confession ended abruptly, I set the fire tonight. Let it take me with the secret. God forgive me. But he'd written this first. Left it with the bodies. A final act of a broken man. Evelyn set the confession aside and reached for the letters. They were correspondence between the Ashfords and their daughter, Clara, in San Francisco. A young woman, maybe 20, waiting for her parents to return from their trip east. They never arrived. These weren't just bones in a cellar. They were parents. A husband and wife. People who'd been loved, mourned, searched for. A daughter who'd spent her entire life wondering what happened. Evelyn's throat tightened. She was the first person in 140 years to know the truth. But then she found something else in the satchel, something that changed everything. Evelyn carried the satchel upstairs, unable to remain in that tomb any longer. She sat by candlelight in her makeshift room, the confession spread before her, and began to read. My name is Silas Holloway, and I am a murderer. The words were jagged, written by a hand that shook with either fear or illness. Some sentences trailed off. Others were scratched out and rewritten. But the story was clear. January 1883. A blizzard trapped two travelers at the inn, Thomas and Margaret Ashford, traveling from San Francisco. Wealthy. Educated. Kind people, Silas wrote. They paid in gold coins. He'd seen the money. More than he'd make in 5 years. And he'd made a choice that would haunt him until his death. He'd poisoned their evening meal. Watched them grow weak, confused. Then he'd carried their bodies to the cellar while they were still breathing, sealed them behind a wall he'd built himself. Took their gold. Burned their belongings. I thought I could live with it, he wrote. I was wrong. The guilt consumed him. He heard them at night, scratching, crying out. Whether real or imagined, it drove him mad. He tried to turn himself in, walked to the sheriff's office twice, but couldn't force the words out. The confession ended abruptly, I set the fire tonight. Let it take me with the secret. God forgive me. But he'd written this first. Left it with the bodies. A final act of a broken man. Evelyn set the confession aside and reached for the letters. They were correspondence between the Ashfords and their daughter, Clara, in San Francisco. A young woman, maybe 20, waiting for her parents to return from their trip east. They never arrived. These weren't just bones in a cellar. They were parents. A husband and wife. People who'd been loved, mourned, searched for. A daughter who'd spent her entire life wondering what happened. Evelyn's throat tightened. She was the first person in 140 years to know the truth. But then she found something else in the satchel, something that changed everything. Beneath the confession lay a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. The front read in Silas's handwriting, "To whoever finds this." Evelyn's fingers trembled as she broke the wax seal. Inside was a legal document, a land deed. She read it twice, unable to believe what she was seeing. Silas Holloway had deeded the inn and 60 surrounding acres not to his family, but to the descendants of Thomas and Margaret Ashford, should they ever be found. His final attempt at restitution. But the deed had never been filed. Never discovered. Until now. Evelyn could find their descendant. Give them closure. Give them what was rightfully theirs. But there was more. A crude map fell from the envelope, showing the property with an X marked beneath an old oak tree. One word written beside it, restitution. She grabbed a shovel from the cellar and walked outside. The oak stood 100 yards from the inn, gnarled and ancient. She began to dig. 2 feet down, her shovel struck metal. She unearthed a rusted iron box and pried it open. Gold coins. Jewelry. The stolen fortune Silas couldn't spend. If you're still watching, please hit subscribe and like this video. And comment below with your country. I love hearing from all of you. Evelyn sat in the dirt, crying for the first time in years, not for herself, but for the strangers whose story she now carried. Evelyn became obsessed. She spent weeks at the library, contacting genealogy societies and historical archives. The trail was cold, 140 years cold, but she refused to give up. Finally, a genealogist in Sacramento traced Clara Ashford's lineage. The line had survived. The living descendant, Rachel Ashford, a 38-year-old elementary school teacher in Oakland, California. Evelyn called her. Explained everything. At first, Rachel was skeptical. Then Evelyn sent photos of the letters, the confession, the locket with Margaret's face. 3 days later, Rachel flew to Montana. They stood together in the root cellar, flashlight beams illuminating the hidden chamber. Evelyn watched as Rachel saw her ancestors' remains for the first time. The teacher's composure crumbled. She wept, for the great-great-grandparents she'd never known, for the family mystery that had haunted generations. "My grandmother used to say they vanished like ghosts," Rachel whispered. "We never knew what happened. My whole life, I wondered." Evelyn handed her the letters. The locket. The confession. "Now you know," she said quietly. "And now they can finally rest." Rachel stood there for a long moment, holding the locket against her chest. Then she looked at Evelyn with an expression that was both grateful and determined. But Rachel did something Evelyn never expected. Rachel held the deed in her hands, reading it by the light filtering through the inn's broken windows. Then she pulled out a pen. "What are you doing?" Evelyn asked. "Signing it back to you." "Rachel, you can't. You gave my family peace," Rachel said firmly. "After 140 years of questions, you gave us answers. You honored them. This place didn't save them, but it saved you. It's yours." Evelyn couldn't speak. Rachel insisted the gold and jewelry go to a historical society in the Ashfords' name. Then she did something more, she shared the story online. The response was overwhelming. A crowdfunding campaign raised $200,000 in 2 weeks. Volunteers arrived from across the country. Contractors donated labor. The Holloway Station Inn began to rise from its ruins. 6 months later, it reopened, not as a tourist attraction, but as a historical landmark and a sanctuary for women in crisis. A place where those who'd been forgotten could find shelter and purpose. Evelyn stood on the restored porch at sunset, watching volunteers work inside, lights glowing through clean windows. She thought of Silas and his guilt. Of Margaret and Thomas and the life stolen from them. Of Rachel and the peace finally given. And she thought of herself, invisible at 62, now visible again. Some places hold secrets. Some hold sorrow. But this one held redemption.